So grasslands have been deteriorating for a long time now, right? And there's no one single thing that's led to their demise. I think you got to go back probably a good 300-400 years to the point at which grasslands were truly flourishing. They made up, in the case of the Southeast, they made up over 120 million acres of the southern landscape. I mean, that's about half of the entire South was some type of grassy open ecosystem, be that a prairie or a savanna, but also grassy woodlands. There was early descriptions by the first settlers that they could take their wagons through the woods because they were so open from the fire. And it sort of leads to the question of, well, what happened? Why did they disappear? And I think most experts are of the opinion that Native Americans were vitally important in managing those landscapes. We certainly had lightning fires in many places across the South, but also the American Indians were setting fire to the landscape for many different reasons, to promote hunting land, for better line of sight so they could see their enemies coming. And so that management with fire, and then let's not forget about, we had bison. Bison, there are many records, especially throughout the upper parts of the South. In the 1600s and 1700s, just, all kinds of accounts. George Washington, the first president, was talking about, writing about bison in West Virginia, for example, in the 1740s. So when we see these first introductions of Europeans coming in, one of the first sort of big things that led to collapse of grasslands was the deterioration of Native American cultures. As diseases wiped out many Native American tribes in the mid-Atlantic region, their ability to manage the landscape as they had been doing for 10,000 years all of a sudden was gone. And many of those early waves of Europeans, they brought with them, plowing for agriculture. They began to sort of put out some of the fires or prevent some of the fires from happening that were critical to that landscape. And those ultimately led to some very rapid changes in the American landscape. As Native American cultures were displaced and their ability to manage the land was affected permanently in some cases, for the first time really beginning, depending on where you are in the United States, some places that was 1720, other places that was in the 1800s, we begin to see this shift toward a different type of view toward land management or different practices to managing the land. And so the grasslands that somehow managed to flourish up until, let's say, the early 1800s, they largely over the past 200 years have been affected by three primary sort of factors. One is that a lot of these grasslands that were kind of on sandy landscapes or maybe rocky, rolling, they had a lot of trees in them, very scattered trees here and there. We call those savannas. Those were maintained by fire. When you take that fire off, then it all grew up into forest. So many of the savanna landscapes across the South, parts of northern Florida, eastern Texas, central Virginia, today they look like forests, and those forests have been there for 200 years. So many people embrace that as a natural landscape, not realizing the forests have actually overtaken the grasslands. The second type of major loss that grasslands have sustained is, these fertile meadows like in the Shenandoah Valley. Those are the very first places that some of the early settlers came. Their sheep, their cattle, their horses grazed those areas. In the 1720s and 1740s, we didn't know about soil conservation and, healthy water and some of those kinds of principles. And sadly, many of those grasslands were severely overgrazed. So by the time you get into the 1800s, how do you combat overgrazing? You bring in the seeds of non-native species like white clover, red clover, timothy grass, and fescue grass, and bluegrass, all of which are non-native species. And you plant those in those meadows to make them better or to, quote, improve them. And so many of those fertile meadowlands became the grazing lands, the pastures that we see today. The Kentucky bluegrass, the Nashville meadows around Nashville, Tennessee, or the Shenandoah Valley. All of these are those kinds of former grassland regions. And then the last type are the what I call the bread baskets of the South. These are the areas with soils that were rich and fertile, that were naturally conducive to being plowed. They became these beautiful native prairies with very few trees. They became the croplands that we see today. So the rice fields of Arkansas and the corn fields of western Kentucky, the cotton fields of central Alabama, these were all formerly prairie regions that have been converted to mostly agricultural landscapes today. So by the time you get to the mid-1900s, most of the wave of grassland loss had already taken place.
So the reason that we're losing all of our grasslands at this unprecedented rate is because grasslands and their natural openness make them the easiest place for development to happen. So if you were going to develop a new subdivision of houses, the easiest choice would probably be somewhere that's open and not a forest full of trees that you have to clear first. We also lose grasslands to things like agriculture because many of them have naturally fertile soils.
What you have left are the leftovers, so anything that can persist largely is persisting in sort of three scenarios. If it's too dry and rocky to maybe develop on, or if it's too wet to do anything with, or sites that just happen to be on the edge of good land, maybe a roadside bank or a power line corridor. That's where the grasslands are today. And you can spot them when you're going down the road if you know what to look for, if you know how to read the signs. But just imagine how many people would look at a power line corridor and think, oh, that's a man-made habitat. Never once thinking that what's in that power line may in fact be the closest thing left to conditions as they were 250 years ago. It just happens to be that mowing sort of simulates the bison grazing or the fire that would have burned that landscape. It's actually everything else around the power line that's grown up. That's what's different. I often say to my students, if my ancestors or their ancestors were to come back to life and walk around this landscape, if many of the Native Americans who had lived 400 years ago could come back to this land where their forefathers had once walked, they wouldn't recognize many parts of the landscape today. It's been utterly changed in many ways. Generally speaking, there's no way to really know how much grassland we've lost. I mean, at least it's a very safe estimate to say we've lost 90% across all types of grasslands. But then there are certain kinds of grasslands which we know we've lost more of than any. Those that are conducive to row crop agriculture, for example, hands down we've lost 99.99% in almost every case. So we have 1/100% left of those types. The sandier, rockier types, we tend to have lost somewhere probably between 90 and 95 to 97%. And so what that means then is if you want to salvage what's left, or if you want to rebuild from what's left, you got to look to those little bitty scraps that remain on the landscape. And that's a big part of what SGI is doing today, is identifying where those scraps are, researching them, making sure we know what species still are there, collecting their seeds from them so that we can begin to rebuild from those. Those are the repositories that we need to go utilize for future conservation efforts.